Hello everyone, welcome to the 7th session of GEE. Now, this session is about Mill's consequentialist theory, which is utilitarianism. Now, the previous session was about Bentham's consequentialist theory. So this is a continuation of Bentham's consequentialist theory, in which Mill tried to develop further Bentham's consequentialist theory. So, as a review, consequentialism believes in the position that the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. If the consequences of an act are good, or if the consequences are more good than evil, then that act is good. But if the consequences of that particular act there are more bad consequences than good consequences, then that act is bad or not moral. So if the consequences are good, the act is right. If they're bad, the act is wrong. In other words, consequentialism looks at the consequences or the results of our actions, and consequentialism judges the moral quality of actions based on consequences or results. Consequentialists consider the ratio of good to evil that an action produces, and the right action is the one that produces or will probably produce as great a ratio of good to evil as any other action. Before we move on to the lesson proper for this session, I'd like you to ask which between the two worlds is better. The first world is world X, in which 1,000 humans have a fulfilled life and 100 humans have a bad life or an unfulfilled life. Versus world Y, in which 10,000 humans have a fulfilled life and 800 an impoverished or poor life. So which do you think between the two worlds is better? World X or world Y? And we'll try to answer this later using John Stuart Mill's consequentialist theory. Okay, so here are some basic details of John Stuart Mill's life. He was a living figure in 19th century intellectual life, and he contributed to the fields of logic, economics, ethics, and social and political philosophy. Today, he is best known for his related defenses of utilitarianism and liberalism. He was born near London in Bentham, England. He was the eldest son of James Mill, an intellectual and reformer closely associated with Jeremy Bentham. So how did John Stuart Mill become interested with consequentialism or utilitarianism, to be specific? He was interested with consequentialism because his father, James Mill, was associated with Jeremy Bentham. That's why, because of Bentham's influence on John Stuart Mill, because of Bentham's influence on James Mill, John Stuart Mill too became interested with utilitarianism. He was a child of James Mill, who was a close friend of Bentham, raised as a living exhibit of the power of utilitarianism. A celebrity as a child, he was touring Europe to defend utilitarianism, and John Stuart Mill was found reading Greek at age of 3. And Mill meets Harriet Taylor, who was already married to John Taylor, and they rode together in a chaste relationship for 21 years. So they were writing each other for 21 long years. And 2 years after the death of John Taylor, they married each other in year 18 51. So the ethical theory of John Stuart Mill is most extensively articulated in his classical text, Utilitarianism, and its goal is to justify the utilitarian principle as the foundation of morals. So Mill wants to establish or wants to use utilitarianism as a principle in judging what is moral and what is not. So this principle says actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote overall human happiness. So just like what we were talking last time, the general principle of utility, in which it wants to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now the key word in John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism is also the promotion of human happiness. So, Mill focuses on consequences of actions and not on rights nor ethical sentiments. So, Mill plainly wants to focus on the consequences of our actions, and Mill wants us to consider the kind of happiness that is being produced when we do or perform a certain action. According to Mill's early essay entitled Bentham, all reasonable moral theories assume that the morality of actions depends on the consequences which they tend to produce. And Mill's own theory of morality is grounded in a particular theory of life, namely that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. So in here we can really see Bentham's great influence on John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, because if you can still remember, Bentham was saying that we are born to be governed by two sovereign masters, namely pleasure and pain. And the ultimate goal of life, as far as utilitarianism is concerned, is to cultivate or to promote pleasure, to maximize pleasure, and to avoid or minimize pain. The same is true with John Stuart Mill, that for him, pleasure and freedom from pain is the only thing desirable as end or goal or as purpose. So we have to see to it that everything we do leads to the maximization or leads to the promotion of pleasure and or happiness. Such a theory of life is commonly called hedonistic, and it seems appropriate to say that Mill conceives his own position as hedonistic, even though he does not use the word hedonism or its cognates. Though Bentham and Mill are both concerned about happiness, about pleasure, about freedom from pain or minimization of pain, and so we can call them as hedonists. Nevertheless, there is a difference between Bentham's and Mill's utilitarianism. Bentham was more of a quantitative hedonist, in which, if you can still remember, he was trying to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number, that everything we do or everything that the government does should lead towards the promotion of the happiness of the greatest number of people possible. Meanwhile, though Mill was also a hedonist, he was also concerned about pleasure and happiness. Mill particularly focused on the quality of happiness that we experience in the things we do or in the things that the government does. And so, Bentham is more of a quantitative hedonist, while Mill is more of a qualitative hedonist. Mill is trying to put to question the quality or the kind of happiness that we experience in things around us. And so Mill's theory of value and the principle of utility. Mill defines utilitarianism as the creed that considers a particular theory of life as the foundation of morals. His view of theory of life was monistic, that there is one thing and one thing only that is intrinsically desirable, and that is pleasure or happiness. In contrast to a form of hedonism that conceives pleasure as a homogeneous matter, Mill was convinced that some types of pleasure are more valuable than others in virtue of their inherent qualities. So this is what I was saying a while ago, that Mill was particularly trying to pay attention to the quality or to the kind of happiness that we experience as we do certain things. That there is a kind of pleasure or happiness which has more intense quality or better in quality than other actions that produce other kinds of pleasure. Mill declares that the more valuable pleasures are those which employ higher faculties. In other words, the pleasures of intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments are better pleasures, or pleasures with better quality. Now, these enjoyments make use of highly developed capacities like judgment and empathy. In short, the kind of happiness, the kind of pleasure that maximizes the intellect, the feelings and imagination and of moral sentiments are better than those that don't. For example, when a person receives a college diploma or when he or she graduates, this experience definitely gives him or her a kind of pleasure in happiness, because almost every one of us wants to earn a college degree in order to have a better work or whatsoever after graduation. So this kind of happiness, the kind of happiness that we experience when we graduate from college is better than any kind of pleasure that we experience. Another is when we are in a meaningful relationship with someone. Being in a relationship with someone gives us a higher kind of happiness and a higher kind of pleasure that we can't experience with other things. So things like this give us a higher level or a higher kind or a higher quality of happiness, and this is the very intention, this is the very thing that John Stuart Mill tries to focus on, that the things we do and the government and the things that the government wants to impose should lead to a kind of happy life. People in the society should live a kind of life in which they are happy than otherwise. In one of his famous sentences, Mill affirms that it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Now, this statement of John Stuart Mill extrinsically distinguishes two kinds of pleasures, namely lower pleasures and higher pleasures. While lower pleasures are kind of pleasures that we share with other animals, but only human beings experience higher pleasures. Now, what are these higher pleasures? These are pleasures which we humans experience. This is a kind of intellectual pleasure, and we should cultivate, we should promote not only lower pleasures, but over and above everything, higher pleasures. Okay. If you look at these images, both humans and animals alike experience a pleasure when we eat something that we like. This kind of pleasure is an example of lower pleasure. There is a certain kind of happiness when we eat things that we want to eat. The best obtainable evidence for value claims consists in what all or almost all people judge as valuable across a vast variety of cases and cultures. And Mill makes the empirical assertion that all or almost all people prefer a manner of existence that employs higher faculties to a manner of existence which does not. Accordingly, the best human life is one in which the higher faculties play an adequate part. So what is this best human life that Mill is trying to promote? This best human life is a kind of life wherein we experience higher pleasures, or pleasures of the emotions, pleasures of the intellect. The best human life is a kind of life that we all aspire to experience. It's a kind of life that every culture, every people in the world aspire to have. Now, the question that Neil wants us to answer is, are we experiencing right now the best human life? Are you experiencing the best human life? Are you, in other words, happy with the kind of life that you have right now? Are we as a people and as a society happy with the kind of society and the kind of the world that we have right now? With the COVID-19 pandemic on the rise, where people get infected with the virus, people suffer from the virus, and people die because of the virus, is this the best human life that we dream of? Is still there a reason for us to be happy with the kind of world that we have right now? Now, these are the questions that Neil wants us to answer. Because whether we like it or not, our individual choices and our individual acts, the same is true with the rules and the policies of the government, all affect the kind of human life that we experience on earth. And so the ultimate question then is, are you happy with the kind of life that you have right now? Do you think the kind of life that you have right now is the best human life possible? Let's take a look at the images in this slide. If you live in this place, in slum areas, do you think you can be happy with your life? Or a dirty river becomes your playground, or you beg on the street for food, or you go to mountains of garbages and scavenge for something that you can use. Is this the best human life that the world can offer to us? And John Stuart Mill wants us to examine because, after all, utilitarianism is for him a foundation of morals. Now, if the answer to the question whether the kind of life that we have right now is the best in the world possible, if the answer to that question is no, then there is definitely wrong with the things we do and the things that the government does. Or living in a society wherein criminality abounds. Living in a society where there is extrajudicial killings. Living in a society where you don't feel you're safe and secure. Is this the best human life possible? Is this kind of life best in the world? Mill postulates that moral judgments presume rules, and Mill thinks that morality builds on social rules. But what makes social rules moral rules? Mill maintains that we name a type of action morally wrong if we think that it should be sanctioned either through formal punishment or public disapproval, or through a bad conscience. So, are our social rules moral? Are our social rules lead to the promotion of happiness? So these are questions that Mill wants us to answer. Or do you personally believe that some wrong things that people do go unpunished? Do you personally believe that bad people in the society have to be punished in order that we create the best human life possible? Or is it the case that we don't experience the best human life possible, or we are not happy with the kind of life that we have right now and with the kind of society that we have right now because some bad people continue to do wrong things? So we now proceed with act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism. The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals, which is utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, which is pain or unhappiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness we mean pain and the privation of pleasure. According to the greatest happiness principle, the ultimate end is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain, and is reached as possible in enjoyments, both in point of quantity and quality. So, over and over again, we try to ask ourselves and we try to examine the world based or through the lens of John Stuart Mill. Is the kind of life and the kind of world that we have right now give us a kind of enjoyment or happiness, both in point of quality and quantity? Do we feel happy qualitatively of the kind of life and the kind of world that we have right now? Is there still a reason for us to be happy despite the pandemic that we're experiencing right now? Are we happy with the kind of government that we have right now and the kind of rules that they impose to the people? If the answer is yes, well and good. But if the answer is no, Mill wants us to re-examine the things that we do and the things that the government imposes, or the policies that the government imposes. Because Mill, at the end of the day, wants to ensure that people experience the best human life possible, and that people experience happiness. It is not surprising that the question whether Mill is an act or a rule utilitarian has been intensely debated. In order to understand this position, it is important to differentiate between two ways of defining act and rule utilitarianism. One can conceive of them as competing theories about objective rightness. An act is objectively right if it is the thing which the agent has most reason to do. Act utilitarianism would say that an act is objectively right if it actually promotes happiness. So when does an act become objectively right based on act utilitarianism? An act becomes objectively right if it actually promotes happiness. For rule utilitarianism, an action would become objectively right if it corresponds to rules that promote happiness. So act utilitarianism is referring to our individual acts, while rule utilitarianism refers to acts that correspond to rules that promote happiness. One can also conceive of act and rule utilitarianism as theories about moral obligation. Act utilitarianism requires us to aim for the maximization of happiness. Rule utilitarianism, in contrast, requires us to observe rules that facilitate happiness. So act utilitarianism wants us to perform things that maximizes happiness, while rule utilitarianism wants us to observe rules or laws or policies that promote or facilitate happiness. Understood as a theory about moral obligation, act utilitarianism postulates that we need to act in a way that promotes happiness the most, while rule utilitarianism claims, on the other hand, that we need to follow a rule whose general observance promotes happiness the most. So how do we apply the standard of morality? Does utilitarianism require us to kill such people who are the cause of no good to any human being, of cruel physical or moral suffering to several? Mill answers in the negative. His main point is that nobody's life would be safe if people were allowed to kill others whom they believe to be a source of unhappiness. Now, what do we do to people who make us unhappy? Can we kill them? Mill says no. Nobody's life would be safe if people were allowed to kill others whom they believe to be a source of unhappiness. Thus, a general rule that would allow to remove men who are a cause of no good would be worse than a general rule that does not allow such acts. People should follow the rule not to kill other humans because the general observance of this rule tends to promote the happiness of all. And Mill argues that in many cases, we can assess the actual expected consequences of an action only if we hypothetically consider that all would act in the same manner. This means that we recognize the consequences of this particular action will be damaging if everyone acted that way. So Mill is trying to point out is that we imagine the advantages or the possible advantages or disadvantages of a particular action if everyone does so. So if we are allowed to kill people who cause no good to us, or if we are allowed to kill people who cause us unhappiness, and if everyone will do the same, then we would feel unsafe. When we feel unsafe, we would feel unhappy. And so we try to recognize that the consequences of this particular action would be damaging if everyone acted that way. So Mill is trying to prove that we have to figure out what the consequences of our actions would be. The formula says that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, which is unhappiness. Roughly said, actions are right insofar as they facilitate happiness and wrong insofar as they result in suffering. And Mill does not write morally right or morally wrong, but simply right and wrong. What is right? A right act is one that produces or promotes happiness, and a wrong act is one that promotes unhappiness. Accordingly, the first formula is not to be interpreted as drafting a moral duty. It is a general statement about what makes actions right or wrong. The first formula says that the promotion of happiness makes an action objectively right, but not necessarily morally right. Or, as Mill says in his system of logic, the promotion of happiness is the ultimate principle of teleology. We should promote happiness. Every person and every government should promote happiness. Not only happiness of any kind, but happiness of a higher quality. An action is objectively right if it maximizes happiness. However, an action is morally right if it is in accordance with social rules which are protected by internal and external sanctions and which tend to promote general utility or general happiness. So we try to ask ourselves, do we cause happiness to other people? Or do you cause pain and unhappiness to other people? If you cause unhappiness and pain to other people, then what you are doing is objectively wrong. Because only when we cause other people's happiness and pleasure, when our action becomes objectively right. And Mill and Utilitarianism as a whole wants us to consider things or wants us to do or perform things that promote not only our own happiness but the happiness of other people. So how do we measure the rightness or the wrongness of our actions? We simply look at the people who become happy or unhappy with the things we do. To summarize the essential points, Mill can be characterized as an act utilitarian in regard to the theory of objective rightness, but as a rule utilitarian in regard to the theory of moral obligation. So we cannot debate whether Mill is more of an act utilitarian or more of a rule utilitarian, but we can safely say that he is both promoting both act utilitarian and rule utilitarian. And he defines morality as a system of rules that is protected by sanctions. According to Mill's second formula of the utilitarian standard, a good human life must be rich in enjoyments in both quantitative and qualitative respects. A manner of existence without access to the higher pleasures is not desirable. But Mill insists that a human life that is completely deprived of higher pleasures is not as good as it could be. It is not a desirable mode of existence, nothing a competent judge would choose. And Mill's statement that every human has an equal claim to all the means of happiness belongs in this context. So when we go back to the images of poverty that I flashed a while ago, we can say that a certain portion of the population in the country and in the world as a whole have no equal claims to to all the means of happiness in the world. In other words, people at the margins, or people who are left behind, people who suffer from poverty, are people who don't experience happiness, who don't experience the kind of human life that is best possible in the world. And the challenge of John Stuart Mill is to create a society, to create a world, or to awaken people to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. As much as possible, no single person in the world should experience unhappiness. But this is obviously difficult to achieve, as people are certain portion of the population are always left behind. Mill even includes the unhappiness of animals, the happiness of animals. Animals too should have the best possible life, so far as the nature of things admits. So we have to realize that not only should humans aspire for happiness, but also animals. Because animals have lives, animals have rights, animals too deserve to live the best life possible. And so, when we consider again the question which world would be better, World X, in which 1,000 humans have a fulfilled life or happy life, and 100 a bad life or unhappy life, versus World Y, in which 10,000 humans have a happy life and 800 a poor or unhappy life. Which one is better? The answer to this question depends on whether we focus on the minimizing the number of bad lives, or in maximizing the number of good lives, and whether we measure this absolutely or relatively to the total population. One possible answer concerns the minimization of the number of bad lives. So if we try to minimize the number of bad lives, then we choose World X, because in World X, only 100 humans have bad life, while 800 humans have bad life in World Y. So this can mean the absolute number of humans with joyless or impoverished lives. If one answers this way, then World X would be better than World Y, because in this world, the absolute number of humans with bad lives would be less. Another possible answer emphasizes the maximization of fulfilled lives. If we focus on the maximization of fulfilled lives, then we would choose World Y, because in World Y, 10,000 humans have a happy life, while only 1,000 humans have happy life in World X. So if one follows this interpretation, then World Y is better than World X, because in this world, absolute and relative measurements suggest that more humans have fulfilled lives. And under the influence of Malthus, Mill insisted throughout his work that the problem of poverty is to be resolved only through a reduction of the population number. As noted, he encouraged the regulation of birth, or birth control, or to curb the rapid increase of population, as there is a relationship between overpopulation and poverty. So Mill is in agreement to the position that we need to reduce the population in order to maximize happiness. For your assessment, this is an essay. Please answer the 4 questions. What is the difference between rule and anti-utilitarianism? And how might the distinction support the utilitarian position on morality? Number 2, how might the utilitarian support or oppose the death penalty? If the government imposes death penalty, will this lead to the best human life possible for everyone? Number 3, why does Mill distinguish between the so-called higher and lower pleasures? Last, what is an application of the principle of utility to a current moral issue? So just think of any current moral issue and apply the principle of utility or utilitarianism. Where to submit? Assessment number 10 output, submit it to my personal messenger account. Always remember to indicate in the page of your notebook your name and the date when you submit your output. It seems that most of the students in my class don't know how to follow this instruction. So that ends session 7 on Mill's consequentialist theory, which is utilitarianism, which focus on the quality of happiness that we experience. See you in the next session. Keep safe and stay healthy, everyone.